So I'd like to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. I realize this is an unconventional time for us, but we thought the topic was important, and so we appreciate your making yourselves available, both those of you who are here physically in PCAMS, and I know there are a number of people who are coming in by way of Zoom, so we thank you all for joining us. We do have a number of handouts that we'll want people at least at the end to have, and those are out front now, or they will be before the end of the meeting. Excuse me? Okay, good. So what I would like to do is set the frame for discussion. The goal for this afternoon is actually to have about half of our time in presentation through slides and about half of the time in Q&A, because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. I would also point out that this is sort of a play in 4 acts. So there are 4 segments that I'd like to go through, and I'm going to try, and I've asked a couple of my colleagues to help me watch the time. So if in any QA session we run out of time for questions, that doesn't mean the question is unimportant. It's really pointing toward the opportunity to continue the discussion at yet another session like this. So please just keep that in mind. So with that in mind, here we are to talk about the Clinical Trials Initiative. You might remember that in this room, the kickoff for this was actually a little while ago. I do believe it was on July 5th, 2017, when we talked about business aspects of clinical trials. And we talked not only about clinical trials management, but we talked about budgeting and ways that we all, by working together, can do a better job. So in many ways, this is a follow-up to that, although you realize we have talked about the Clinical Trials Initiative in the lunch and learns that have been organized by Meredith and her group with participation from a number of groups around campus. There have also been a long series of discussions that Mark and I have had with individual study teams and with department leadership, typically the chair, but sometimes also vice chairs for research. And this has been part of an intentional effort to continue to reach out so that we can all know where we're going and how we can work together to get there. So if I'm lucky enough to figure out how to get this going. Couple of things. What are we going to do today? So the 4 chapters. The first is going to be a brief overview of the Clinical Trials Initiative. And then the primary focus for today are going to be some points about what I would call study feasibility, especially as it impinges on site selection. We're going to have some comments about implementation. That will be not only standardized budgets, but also the study management fee. We're going to talk about recruitment strategies and implementation as well. And then we're going to talk about study management, the clinical trials management systems with a primary emphasis on safety. As a sidebar, not on here, we have a special guest, first-time attendee, who I will get ready, Adam. A little bit later, this is Adam's first time, and it's a chance for him to meet all of us, both formally and informally. Okay, so what are the overarching goals for the Clinical Trial Initiative? And I hope this slide, you'll see it and you'll say, yep, I've seen this 5 times already. Please move on. But it has been shown that many times, and our goal is innovative therapies, excellence in the conduct and the management of the clinical trials, and of course, the growth of the clinical trials portfolio. And when Jason and Franny join us, they'll be able to give us some specific data with regard to that. But before we jump into some specifics, what I would like to do is talk about several large buckets, not all of which we'll have time to talk about tonight, but ones that I think are really important for us to be aware of. So bucket number one is accreditation. Of course, we have GCP standards. They're required as part of the UAB procedure, and they're expected, I think, really nationwide. But I think it's important for us to realize there's a major national movement now, not just for the accreditation of individuals, to make sure that we have the proper background. Franny, there's a seat up front. But there's also the issue of site accreditation, which is going to be dependent on all of us working together. That site accreditation initiative is being led by a group that calls itself the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. We will have a handout from them on the table for you to take. It's got not only what's going on with CTTI, but it's got their website so you can go and find out what's happening. It's our sense that that initiative is gaining ground, and we'll see more in this calendar year 2019. The second major bucket in the Clinical Trials Initiative relates to scientific rigor, and this has to do with rigorous study design, consistency in the way we implement the trials, and transparency, not only internally across our teams, but transparency with the participants as well, so they know what's happening. There are a couple of things that have been active over the last year and a half or so. Scientific review committees, medicine has taken the lead with that, so thank you very much, Cindy. I think what I heard, and these are my words, not Cindy's official words, is initially maybe it wasn't entirely clear that this was necessary, quite the way it was done, but it was a mandate from the NIH through the CCTS saying, please do this. And I think we found that overall it hasn't added a lot of time, and it actually has brought value to a number of projects. So thank you. We've also talked about SMART IRB, which is the reliance-based IRB reviews, and of course, clinical trials, registration, and posting. Is there anyone who remembers the little jingle that we put together about clinicaltrials.gov? Does anyone remember that? Brian? There is a call to send out that jingle once again to everybody who's badged into this meeting and to all the people who are coming in on the Zoom, so that they remember that wonderful little jingle. Yeah, my better half was angry at me for quite some time after that as I sang that jingle at home. But we're not going to pay further attention about those two buckets. The three buckets we're going to take some pieces of today have to do with site identification and study feasibility. You can read multi-site initiatives with SHARE, which is a regional initiative, and NCATS's Trial Innovation Network, and how sites are now being identified. And we have data on that. I think it really is a harbinger of not the future. It's really an indicator of what's here now and will continue to grow. Second thing, we'll talk about implementation. And that should say FDP instead of ACTA. Sorry, it will be interesting to see what other, as we go through version control on this slide deck, whatever things come up, we'll talk a little bit about time to activation. Adam, that's going to be your call to get up and introduce yourself. And a lot of stuff about recruitment, because there's been a lot of work in that space, and then some comments about effective study management. Okay, so first of all, site identification and feasibility. Is there anyone in the room who has heard about SHARE? Well, thank you, Matt. That was a paid hand raise. You know, it's sort of like polling. Who else has heard about SHARE? Okay, so this is a learning opportunity. SHARE stands for the Southeast Health Alliance for Research. And what it represents is a clinical trial network which is built upon the partner network of the CCTS. Not surprisingly, there's the map of the partners in the CCTS. Obviously, for clinical trials, you partner with those that are healthcare provider organizations. Hudson Alpha doesn't quite qualify as a healthcare provider organization, but it's built on the institutions that are there. Just to know that, so you know, maybe I can make this work a little better. I just want you to know that the partner network really reflects the work of a lot of people. Most of the purpose of the partner network is not for the implementation of clinical trials, but for lots of other kinds of activities in training, review of studies, pilot studies, so on and so forth. You can see a lot of the activities on the right-hand side of this graphic, but I just wanted you to know this partnership is very real. It's rather incredible, and we've seen over the last several years the partnership grow. So somehow the mouse loves this. So here's a little bit more detail about SHARE and the institutions that are involved in SHARE. So going from left to right, Auburn, yeah, Hudson Alpha is there in case there's any genomics, but LSU, Ochsner, Pennington, Tulane, UA, Tuscaloosa, UAB, Mississippi, and South Alabama. That's backwards. So this is going to be what's going to work for me. And you can see why you SHARE. I would say for anyone who would like a PDF of this deck after the meeting, so you can refer to it, we'd be happy to send it out. So I know you're all busy scratching down notes with a pad that's on your lap, but you don't have to. You want to just think about the questions you might have about this. The second major network in clinical trials is the Trial Innovation Network. This is stood up by NCATS. There's the website for it, trialinnovationnetwork.org. If you want to go to NCATS website, that's okay too. But I'd like to show you a little bit something about how these work. So if you're an industry sponsor and you have a trial and you want to identify what are the sites that you would like to work with, the historical way that the sites have been identified is what I would call the who do you know networking. And that's important. Relationships are really important. But what's happened is that there's been the realization that sometimes the people you know, you love to get together with, but they may not have the patients for the trial. And sometimes in that discussion, maybe the investigator, him or herself, doesn't even know whether they have the patients. So, of course, what do they say? Yes, sure, we can do that. We'll make it work. We know we can. We're good. So I'll show you some data on relative success in recruitment based on national statistics, which mirror what happens at UAB. But Trinetics, a spin-out from UCSF, thought there might be a better way. And to cut to the chase, Trinetics now has a way in a totally HIPAA-compliant fashion for any given clinical phenotype, which would be persons who are candidates for a clinical trial, to go into to get information from our medical record, all de-identified, about how many patients we might have that could be eligible for the trial. This now happens, it's set up through the cooperation of the Informatics Institute, it's built on I2B2. So before they even approach a site or a person, they already know the answer to the question, do you have the patients? And that's led to a different way of them recruiting sites. The other way is, how about for federally sponsored projects? The same thing happens. The mechanism is different. It's called ACT, or ACT Network, the Accrual to Clinical Trials, and that's governed by TIM. And I'll show you a little bit about that and then give you some data. So, I2B2 Trinetics, you might say, well, do any studies actually come to UAB through Trinetics? And the answer is yes. We've been in Trinetics now for about 2.5 years. We were one of the early adopters, and you can see in calendar 2018, 47, the opportunity to participate in 47 clinical trials came just through this portal alone. And you can see we were able to accept roughly about half. That depends on, is there a PI here that's interested? Do we have competing trials? That kind of thing. But you can see right there, just in 2.5 years, we've had more than 100 trial opportunities come to UAB in a totally new way.
Also for the cancer side?
Excuse me?
Who is using TriNet and Division? This is the first time I've heard about TriNet.
Right, so that's one of the reasons for having our get-together. What we will do is the Trinetics query comes to the CCTS, and then based on the content space of the trial, we will then make the connection with either the division, the department, the division, or in some cases a particular investigator to say, are you interested? Do you have the capacity? Both in terms of your interest, competing trials, stuff like that. Another way is through the federally, when it's a federal sponsor or a federal funder, now the NIH can go to the Trial Innovation Network and actually do the same thing. They can go and say, the PI of that trial can go and say, show me the academic medical centers around the country that have enough patients to be considered to be a candidate for this trial. And they will get the names of those centers. And then, as you can see highlighted in yellow, if we are one of those, and then the query comes to us, if we are interested, then we provide cohort numbers. And that's the way the trials are beginning to come through a very similar construct, but a different pipeline instead of from industry coming from federal sponsors.
Oh, could you do a quick acronym check for people just in case they're not aware of what TIN versus RIC is, so they kind of understand that dynamic a little bit?
So I often get confused by the alphabet soup, but TIN is the Trial Innovation Network. So think about this as the network being built, actually built, it's now very active, involving all CTSAs across the nation. RIC is a Recruitment Innovation Center. So there are capacities, I would urge you, and it will be on one of the sheets for you to take home. There's going to be the website for the Trial Innovation Network. Go there and you can see all the different things that you can get through what we affectionately call the TIN, the Trial Innovation Network, in terms of support for clinical trial development, review, recruitment through the CCTS. Okay, so that's the end of the first chapter. Thank you for the question. Any other questions that you might have at this time based on that?
Are you hoping that COVID now sponsor approach PR for some reason they know for working for over the years? They approach them, offering a study they are planning on, they ask for input, So the idea with this is that it's gonna come to CCTS and the division are not gonna receive those.
So I think, let me repeat the question. And Brian, thank you for being alert to the microphone. I think the question was, I understand now there's a new way that trials will come to the attention of UAB and there'll be an opportunity to participate. But does that mean it's going to completely replace the relationship-based way that has been the way it's been done for so many years? I think the answer there is no, at least not all at once. I think what we're going to see is a transition, because one of the things that both industry has learned and NIH has learned is that relationship way doesn't work. And I'll show you recruitment data to prove that. So they're looking for new ways, but certainly if they're good relationships, everyone wants to keep those going as well. So think of it as a both and, recognizing that using simply one way, as in the past, hasn't really carried sufficient water to be successful. Does that help?
Thank you.
Other questions about share or tin? So if we were to re-ask the question, who in the room has heard about share? Is there anyone in the room who, well, now I understand everyone's got an elbow problem. This is really important, guys, because what we've learned through Trinetics is we've seen a constant uptick in the traffic coming through Trinetics. This is what's happening going forward, and it's really important that we be aware of that.
So, Dr. Kimberly,
Yeah.
Speaking of share, as it relates to share, those investigators with investigator-initiated trials that they would like to try and build a multi-site strategy for, who should they call? How should they connect to share?
So Franny is here in the front row. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about recruitment. But I've sort of thought about recruitment in two ways. Recruitment of studies, and that has to do with site performance, site relevant patients, and share and the tin. Another, of course, is given that you have a study, recruitment of participants, and are there ways that we can engage share, engage tin to help in that? The answer there is clearly yes. We can do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Any other questions? Okay. So, second chapter, implementation. And what I'd like to do is talk about consistent standardized budgeting and contracting for a little bit, competitive time to activation, and consistent achievement in meeting stated recruitment goals. So first of all, what's happening in the budgeting contracting space? You'll see that that ACTA, which should have been removed from the earlier slide. FDP stands for Federal Demonstration Project. The CTSAs nationwide have been involved in a federal demonstration project trying to harmonize contracts across institutions. This is a big lift. I would say that progress has been made, but there's still a lot more progress that needs to be done. For those of you who work in this space, you know, even sometimes across institutions to get harmonized practices doesn't always come naturally. And so if within an institution that's a challenge, imagine what it is across institutions. But there are a couple of really important things to be aware of. We'll talk about this in the CTSA NIH space, but I am aware of a very large corporation that's thinking about doing the same thing with academic medical centers in the industry space. So what's happening nationwide? First of all, there's a lot of reorganization going on of clinical trials processes. For those of you who have followed the series on clinical trials in the New England Journal of Medicine, this has been over the last several years. I think if there's one point on which there is consensus, and that is that the clinical trial mechanism is embodied in the United States, doesn't work very well. There are a lot of trials that don't meet our enrollment goals. It takes a lot of time. It's very expensive. There's got to be a better way. So virtually every institution I have talked to and we'll get to those that a group of us have talked with, everybody is in the process, at some stage of the process, of reorganizing their clinical trials machinery with a number of different goals in mind. Part of that is standardizing operating procedures, and that's budgeting, so that there is a consistent message to sponsors coming from different aspects of the institution. Training, consistency in training. You probably all encountered, even within UAB, when you talk to people who are in clinical trials across different teams, you'll probably get the sense that there's some variability in the depth of experience and in the training. And that's always a way in which we can improve, as well as implementation. How do we actually keep track of things? Ranging from sometimes it's pencil and paper, sometimes it's Excel, sometimes Access. But I think there's an increasing movement in the third bullet point from what I'll call the ad hoc to the CTMS. And for those of you who are not familiar with the acronym, CTMS is Clinical Trial Management System. So you might ask, in getting these generalizations, who's involved in this and what's the basis for making these comments? Mark, myself, Franny, Jason Nichols, we have called more than 20 institutions, sometimes from CTAO to CTAO, sometimes based on relationships with major trialists, lots of different ways of doing it. And this is a partial list of the institutions that we've talked to. It's very interesting. Some of these institutions have been remarkable in terms of their generosity in sharing very detailed information. I was a little bit surprised, but probably the leader in that pack is Yale. Yale has given us line item information which details how they work. And they're more than willing to have us share that amongst ourselves. And I suspect if we even wanted to do a site visit and go up and see how they really do things, they would be willing to do that as well. So based on these discussions, can we get a little bit more specific about what institutions are doing? And here are a couple of themes that the group that did these interviews, the four of us, here are some of the themes that we pulled out. And I realize there's some ambiguity in the Yale bullet, so let me clarify that. Yale experienced a 38 to 58% increase, the average was 52, increase in the upfront budgeted costs, meaning for the same scope of work, they were able to negotiate budgets that were on average, 52% higher once they had a coordination of the way they did their budgeting process. We can talk if you want about how they define coordination of budgeting process. You know, in the discussions that I've had, sometimes I've gotten comments, especially from PIs, well, gee, we can't put the expenses on the budget. We shouldn't be doing that. I would just point out that Duke expects a 10% surcharge on total direct costs on the entire clinical trial budget on top of IDC. When you do the math, that's a pretty hefty, call it whatever you want, administrative fee or administrative expectation. Duke seems to be doing okay. Their business is about 5-fold larger than anybody else in the nation. So they may have something to teach us.
Is that through the DCRI or is that through the institution itself?
It's the 10% surcharge is for Duke University. And DCRI is sometimes considered part of Duke University and sometimes it's not. So on a study-by-study level, Lou, I can't tell you because we don't have that information. But Duke has actually been very generous in sharing their PowerPoint or their in PDF form, not only about their budgeting, but also about some of their best practices. We don't have those handouts today, but we can certainly make those available because they've done this in full disclosure.
So I'll just throw out there relative to that, and this is just me based it on my memory of reviewing information previously specific to Duke was, I believe that was, if you think about their model for the university itself, they have their DOCR, Duke Office of Clinical Research, and then they have specific disease entities. So maybe there's or pods or different models, however you want to talk to it. So if you maybe say cardiology is one, the rheumatology versus whatever, it's kind of like spokes on the wheel. And so each of those would have that specific surcharge for that disease group, if you want to kind of view it that way. But that's the way I remember off the top of my head, at least without going back and looking at the notes specific.
So you might want to turn the mic off on the bottom. One of the things we've asked about systematically is indirect costs on clinical trials. Here our sampling is 26 institutions. The range is 25 to 43%. The average is 30.06. I'm sure you all know that currently that's 30% on total direct costs, and that's currently our IDC charge. There's some discussion about maybe some differences for investigator-initiated trials, but right now this is the policy for us, and it's right at the national average. Most of the institutions actually are at 30%, but there is a range. We asked about administrative startup costs, and one of the challenges there was every institution defines administrative startup costs differently. They bundle differently. So it's a little bit hard to unpack that, but at a minimum, we've seen administrative startup costs of $10,000. I think this was University of Minnesota, if I'm remembering correctly, up to $25,000. We know from some other interviews, clinical trial units a little bit earlier in the year, that we know some that go substantially higher than that. But everything. And I think the other thing that's become clear is everybody speaks to the fact that, if we could actually do a better job on both invoicing and then following up on our invoices, the accountants call this accounts receivable. If we could do a better job of that, they would really appreciate it. The example I have in mind is when Yale re-engineered their process, they found one investigator in pediatrics that had almost $500,000 of charges he could have invoiced for whatever reason he hadn't done. And so one of parts for our clinical trials initiative is to see if we can do a better job with that. So, these numbers, do they make sense nationally? This is a infographic taken off the Forte website. Web address will be in the handout at the end of our time this morning, or this afternoon too. It was a long weekend, guys, and you can tell from this rather inelegant slide that I was looking for ways we could get verifiable data. This is based on a survey of over 800 people, so this is not just a sampling of one or two. It's of over 800, with I think 635 respondents out of the 800 queried. And the estimated cost of initiating a site is somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000. You can go on to to Forte's website and take a look, see what you think about their data. So one of the things we thought we would do today is reinforce a couple of points. And these are handouts we have for you. First of all, we do have a study management fee that has been under discussion for quite some time, went through final hoops of approval, and was disseminated by way of CTAC last week. And these are for industry-initiated, industry-sponsored trials. And that's $4,500 when the Western IRB is used and $5,500 when everything is internal to UAB. Sometimes folks say, well, gee, I need a memo to affirm that in fact this is the case. And so outside you will have their hard copies of that memo, but that memo should also be posted live on the DPR's website now. Having said that, I see Madeline smiling. I didn't try the links this morning, but we were told that they would actually be active last Wednesday in preparation for today. If you have trouble, please let us know because we'll make sure then that the links work. The second handout, or a second handout, will be a more detailed description of what goes into that memo, which is signed by Dean Vickers, Chris Crown, Vice President for Research, and myself. That will also be on the DPR's website, and it will come in two flavors. One is the description in detail, which will be available to anyone who surfs the web. And then for those who are very interested, behind a Blazer ID, there's down to the dollar, I believe. I think finally the 33 cents may have gotten rounded off. But I think that information, if that's important to you, that's available too. The reason it's behind the Blazer ID is the feeling is that's important for us to have available as a community, but that really is not anything that a sponsor needs to know. So those two things are posted there. The other thing, and do we have Cindy's handouts out on the, are they out? Are they there? Okay, so thank you to Cindy. Working through the Department of Medicine, there is now a handout still with a watermark draft because we may want to polish a few bits of it. But there is information about what's thought to be how we should be thinking about constructing budgets. What's reasonable to put in budgets and when you put something in, it's there. And I would make 2 points. One is that it's important for us to realize what activities are fair and appropriate for us to charge for. And I think we all have the opportunity to make sure that we put all of those activities into our budget so that we can recoup the real cost, monies to cover the real cost that we experience. Now, you might be thinking, well, gee, I already do that. And that may be true for some, but I promise you that not everybody in our community fully gets that. And I'm going to share an anecdote where the persons involved will remain nameless. It was actually a discussion with a clinical department chair in this medical center. And I was talking with him or her about clinical trials, what could we do better? You know, I was giving the pitch. And the question I got back was, you mean we can actually charge for our time and effort in a clinical trial? That industry will pay us? And then we went and looked at clinical trials where this particular individual was PI, and there was no budget. He or she was working completely pro bono. And that probably is an extreme, but it actually is true. And so I give you that narrative just to encourage us to look very carefully. Cindy, thank you for being willing to share that sheet. And if there are suggestions, either for the Department of Medicine or what we might be doing across the enterprise, please let us know. because these are things that I think that can help us all do a better job. Any other questions about budget? Okay. You know, it's a good thing there are not so many questions, because I've realized I'm doing a lot of talking up here, and that was not really the intent. So don't be bashful, guys, because the whole point, and I know in individual conversation, there are typically a lot of questions that come up, and it may be that we won't have the answers to all of them, but we will be taking notes about what should we, if need be clarifying, what other issues should we address, those kinds of things. So we need your help in pulling all of this together.
I would like to give you, it's not a question, it's feedback.
Sure.
On the topic of implementation,
Sure.
What I've seen in the last month is when I'm looking for where we can reach more participants, I've seen, at least I work in nephrology, some private practice, I'm doing more research now. So private practice used to be because referral were a good source for us, for participants. And I think that is changing. So I think it's something that we're going to have to take in account for. And I don't know if that's happening in another specialty. And the other point that strikes me with this is implementation, when you mentioned about the time since these 8 months, since the time that you are in contact with the pre-visit to you may start study. I think it's really hard to get to that point, but now is for me at least that I kind of handle all that in my nephrology part. I'm not talking about transplants here. Is that OSP, IRV, FAP at some point, everybody is extending their time. So then my time are getting more stretched, and I'm guilty of the same thing. You know, so I think that is what we're gonna do to solve that.
Right. So and you've raised a really important topic. I'd lump it in what's typically called time to activation. I think that actually would warrant a whole meeting unto itself, because there are many facets to that. I would promise you there are a number of people who are working on that. And I think what I've learned in doing that is sometimes it might be persons who are in central administration that are contributing, but I'll also promise you there are lots of times it's the study teams that are contributing to a longer time to activation. My bias is if we come together and realize that all of us, no matter what seat we're sitting in, can benefit from improving TTA. That's part of site accreditation. That's why I started with that. I think we can solve this. And if, with your permission, I'd like to take your suggestion to make that another form, because we can go into great detail there about what we know is happening and ways we can improve. But you also pointed to recruitment, so thank you very much, because the next little bit is about recruitment. So does anyone know what % of studies meet their recruitment goals by the time the study closes?
Very low, I know. 20? That's what I heard.
Could be that low. The number might be on the slide in front of you. 39%. Let's round that off a little bit, take a little bit of liberty. 2 out of 3 trials failed to meet recruitment goals. If they failed to meet recruitment goals, they failed to have the statistical power necessary to answer the question they were designed for. That means we're wasting our time, to be a little bit extreme, we're wasting our time 2/3 of the time. And that's just I hope there's nobody in the audience that thinks that's acceptable. So why does recruitment fail? Well, there probably are as many answers to that, or suggestions as answers to that, as there are individuals who are asked the question. But I think the critical point is to realize that 2/3 of the time, and this is not just limited to academic medical centers, this includes private practices. They fail to meet goals. But you are quite correct. Some private practices are now realizing if they really do a good job, they can make money. Not to say that's their only goal, but we have to realize they are now seeing opportunity here and they're going after it. So it's up to us. We have to decide, do we want to go along or not? So here are some of the things that we could talk about in terms of things that are related to meeting stated recruitment goals. One, are announcements of study availability. Over the last number of months, there have been discussions about print, radio, digital media, in-person contacts, booths over in TKC, as well as clinicaltrials.gov. We have, let me pause. Everyone in this room, how many have heard of SHARE? Okay, good. So now I know at least there's a possibility for feedback. Has anyone heard of I2B2? Great. If you're recruiting, do you care about I2B2? Why?
Because we help to identify the number of patients that we may have in that.
Absolutely. You can know not only in the first for feasibility how many patients might meet rather high level, but these criteria, so you know whether at least you got a game or not. And then once you go through the IRB and get permission, you can get individual level data. And that's your recruitment. That's your recruitment roster, if you wish. So I2B2 supported, hub-based, individual level information. That's another way with data-driven investigator-initiated recruitment efforts. You can use Dr. Mona Fouad's recruitment and retention facility, which gives you, if you choose, personnel who are experienced in doing this. And they also engage in patient navigation to not only recruit, but help retain patients in studies. So what you start with at the beginning, you can have at the end, because, you know, to be complete, you have to have your participants complete the entire study. And you can also use network resources, SHARE, and you can use the TIN. Who's heard of expert trials? So Madeline doesn't count. I saw 3 hands, 4 hands, 4 hands. So let me give you a quick thumbnail. Expert trials is a way it's available through the UAB Medicine website for a participant coming in by the web to find out if there's a trial at UAB that might be of interest to them. It's all done through natural language. That's what NLP stands for, natural language processing. And it does an NLP search of clinicaltrials.gov, which is updated, I think, every week, if not every 2 weeks. There are also other participant-initiated opportunities, Trials Today, Research Match, eReporter. Anyone familiar with those? Okay. I hope you keep all of those entities informed of what we're doing. And then sometimes there's a sponsor-initiated effort. It's called 3Wire. You can't raise your hand. Who's heard of 3Wire? Gosh, 3 people. 3Wire is actually a commercial entity coming into this space, realizing that recruitment is a challenge. And if the sponsor wishes, so this is sponsor initiated, But that also means it's sponsored, paid for out of a separate budget. They will provide, I'll call it recruitment capacity because it comes in several different ways, but it might even be a recruiter to help. Sometimes it might be recruitment strategies. If you prefer to do that in NIH space, that's what the Trial Innovation Network provides through the Recruitment Innovation Centers. Not the people, but the strategies and some of the tools and the infographics. So I've already talked about this before, where the query comes in from the industry sponsor with Trinetics or comes in from the federal agency by way of the ACT network. But what we're talking about here is investigators can flip that and use the Trial Innovation Network to find partners across the nation, understand who has the patients you want, and can actually, the TIN will help you make those contacts for your study. So the TIN works in both ways. I'm going to skip by these. They'll be in the handout if you wish. But here, this arrow of how it works, instead of being in the middle box, where if we're interested, we'll provide to someone providing us with a query, we are the initiator of the query. And we can go out to the national network if and when we think we have a multi-site trial. We can also do this through SHARE when we want to be regional, where we have the relationships already set up. This is what the page for expert trials looks like. You can put in a natural language query like heart. This is what's come back from expert trials. And these are people who are coming in, potential participants who are coming in through the web, expressing an interest in a clinical trial at UAB, and enough interest so they're willing to provide us with contact information. The whole reason is that gives us the ability to come back to them and then screen them to see if they're suitable for a clinical trial. And you can see the statistics there. So far, and this has been for how long, Jennifer, now?
Not just going on a year.
Okay, so about a year. We've had almost 900 people express interest in a clinical trial at UAB this way. And you can see of those, 48 have enrolled in trials. We've got about 200 pending. That actually speaks to the ability, and I'll say frankly, the interest of study teams to use this as a mechanism for recruitment. And we've got 600 some odd who are not, who have not enrolled.
Is this the one that is got connected directly with clinical trial? Because I went reviewing this website, somebody mentioned to me, and sometimes you click and tell you to clinicaltrial.org for information. If this is not the same?
No, this is not this site. There's the landing page down in the lower left. It's on the uabmedicine.org, and there's a sign, there is a phrase which says find a clinical trial. Click on that. You'll come to this query page. You type the condition that you're interested in using English, and it will do a natural language processing query of clinicaltrials.gov and come back with all of the trials that might be of interest to you. You then, as the incoming participant, can click on those trials whose titles sound interesting and learn about the trial in real time. Okay? Okay, any other questions? All right. So I promised something in competitive time to action, and one of the issues there has been, and I think a major step forward, has been Adam's recruitment to UAB. So Adam, this is your moment. I know you've been waiting for this, so you might just stand up, introduce yourself briefly, and we will not quiz you, at least today.
Okay. Save up those questions though. I'm ready. So my name is Adam McClintock. I am the new IRB director. here at UAB. I come to you most recently from a rather large health system in Ohio called the Ohio Health Corporation. I spent almost 2 years there helping them redesign their processes, modernizing their policies and procedures, and helping get them prepared for the revisions to the Common Rule. Yeah, some of you may have heard of that. Before that, I spent about 12 years at the IRB office at the Ohio State University. I started there at the front desk and worked my way through there. In the last 5 years I was there, I spent in the role of operations manager, where I led the day-to-day frontline staff through IRB processes, the expedited reviews, convened reviews. And I really focused there on process improvements and efficiencies and redesigning how we did the work. As part of that, I lived through and led about 3 or 4 different transitions to new electronic systems. So been there. Over the past 2 weeks, I'm starting my 3rd week. Over the past 2 weeks, I've really been out there getting to know some of you in the room and continuing to build those relationships. I've been getting to know the IRB staff a little better and really just assessing needs, stakeholder needs, both within the IRB office, how we can better serve you guys, and of course, assessing the needs of the research community as researchers, research staff, research leadership, and really figuring out how we can all work together to reduce that time to implementation. So, very excited to be here.
And we look forward to bringing you back when we can bring some issues to
Some
you.
real questions.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, last comments. I did want to make a couple of comments about effective study management. As you know, we are well into the implementation of Encore and Power trials. And I thank you all because we are now, everyone with at least clinical billables is up and live in Encore. This has been a big lift, and thank you very much. The project continues. We're now in the midst of implementing the financials, which quietly is re-engineering the financials of the health system and the university. So it's probably a little bit more than we originally expected it to be. And then after that, we will move to those clinical studies and trials that don't have clinical billables. But that's not the major point I wanted to make. One of the reasons for doing the CTMS initiative is really so that we can meet our goals for excellence in the performance of clinical trials. And that requires not only attention, of course, to the study design and performing things, the appropriate things at the right time, and helping us keep track of what we do so that then we can invoice appropriately so we have a sustainable operation. But patient safety is also a major issue for us. Has anyone here used any of the research summaries that are posted in the electronic health record? Has anyone written them? Okay. Because that's actually what they're for. These are for the folks in the emergency room. When someone comes into the emergency room and they're part of the UAB medicine enterprise, when someone comes into the ED, those at the point of contact, could also be over in TKC, but the real issue, if they're in the emergency room, we want to have the information about that study available to that healthcare provider on the spot so they can make the appropriate decisions for that patient at that time. I can't tell you how important this is to the Board of Trustees. When you mention patient safety, it comes in several different ways, but in the clinical trial space, this is it. They really want to see that all the studies that we have going and the participants in those studies, that we're able to link those bits of information. So I'd like to show you something. If you focus on the right-hand side, you'll see we have something in excess of 550 trials active, at least by this inventory 10 days ago. And that's pretty accurate because when you cross-check in clinicaltrials.gov, it's actually on the expert trial slide. You wouldn't have seen it because it was sort of small. It's within 8 studies. So there's really good concordance. And what I want to point out is this. We've got well over 90% compliance of getting research summaries in the charts of all of the people who are on clinical trials within the UAB medical ecosystem. And we do that because we are using Encore, and through Encore we go to Power Trials. And thank you very much for writing those research summaries. They don't, in fact, we want them very much not to be more than a page long, because the persons in the ED, they don't need a book. What they need is the critical information in order for them to make the appropriate clinical decision on the spot. So I want to thank those of you who have written those, to invite those of you who haven't but are involved in clinical trials. When you have a chance to write a summary, now you know why it's there. And in talking with Janice Samford in the ED, we're actually now surveying how often they're used. The point I make, it only takes one instance where the information in this research summary has been important for clinical care, for the patients we serve, to make the whole effort worthwhile. So I want to thank you for that. All the other stuff with regard to the clinical trial management system, happy to have those discussions, but that's probably for another day. So what I'd like to do is just say, okay, we've been through all of this stuff. Bob has been talking for quite some time. You have lots and lots of handouts. What would you like to do next? And I mean that in 2 ways. Time for questions right now, but I'm also asking you for feedback for, as you go through that material, what are the questions you have? Where are the places where we need to be more clear? What can we do as we strive to position ourselves so that, frankly, when site accreditation comes, and it will when you go through the CTTI stuff, that for us it's just straightforward. We're already well prepared. So, floor is open for comments, for questions, any kind of feedback you'd like. Yeah, thank you.
I gotta say I'm a little confused about the study management fee. In the frequently asked questions, one of the areas it talks about, even if the IRB is not approved, that the department still owes the fees, or the study still owes the fees. And what we have difficulty with is trying to recoup our cost, our administrative cost, and now on top of having to include these study management fees as well. We feel like CCTS and this study management fee will take priority, and the departments will lose its edge on recouping its administrative costs. We had a situation not too long ago where a faculty member had a study going. He decided that he was going to resign and go to private practice. He contacted the study, the sponsor, without our knowledge, and said, I'm no longer going to do this study. And we had put all this work into it, and we're not able to recoup our costs. So looking at this, if this had been in effect, we would have had to pay $5,000 some dollars for the IRB approval that we may or may not have gotten, but we would not have been able to recoup any of our costs at the department level.
So I think there are it's an important question, and there are a couple of ways to think about it. When any group is starting up a study, they are experiencing real cost of personnel time, There's also real personnel costs that are experienced by the IRB, CIRB, and by the CTMS team. I would point out that CCTS is not part of that. We are the organizer. We don't get a cut. And the question comes up, how do we cover those costs? And I think there are two ways that we should be thinking about it. Certainly, all the actual costs should be incorporated into study budgets. But I think everyone who thinks about these working in this space realize that not every study is going to work out exactly the way you want. And that what we also need to do is we need to have in the budget you put together, you need to put together a budget which will cover those unusual circumstances like you just described, so that over the year that's covered. Industry expects that. That's not a problem. What industry wants is they want studies that are done well and recruitment that's achieved efficiently and appropriately. And it is well worth it to them. I think sometimes in discussions that I've had, we haven't always appreciated the proper balance of these various factors. And I think there are a number of successful units on campus that have taken the perspective I just outlined. And maybe it would be helpful, we can connect you with some of the people in those units so you can get a sense of not only how do they construct their budgets, how do they negotiate their budgets, and what has been the implication for their sustainability based on those two factors. And I think if we could connect you guys, you would find your question may be answered. And we'd be happy to do that.
Just to clarify a little bit about what you said,
Sure.
the contract was never executed. So we got to the point where the budget was negotiated, but he told the sponsor right before it was signed that he was leaving,
Sure.
and so they got out. So we didn't get the startup fee, so we wouldn't get this administrative fee either.
Sure. No, I do understand that. And I think there has been some discussion about whenever we as an organization get involved in clinical trials, should we really think of two contracts? The first contract is a contract to have the discussion about startup. And so happy to engage, but whatever the number is, that's the number. And that provides the resources to do all the work to actually stand up the study. That certainly, to me, that makes sense, but I'm not sure we as an organization are ready for that yet. I think honestly, the first step we have to get to is just realize we've got to start constructing budgets that are realistic in terms of the costs we experience. And I will tell you, they are not. That doesn't mean they are not for virtually every unit. But we have lots of information that says, frankly, for the majority of the units on campus, the budgets don't yet cover real experience costs. This is opportunity for us. And I think one of the reasons to going to all the other institutions around the country is the ones that have done that and maybe are a step or two further along in their redesign process have demonstrated that you can do it. And industry is not going to walk away, especially if we deliver with efficient time to activation, good, efficient recruitment. That's what they want. So the budget is part of the piece, but then we have to deliver too. And that's part of the clinical trials initiative. And I'm glad to see that Adam has taken out his book and made a note about gotta make time to activation work. Is that what you were writing down in your book?
Word verbatim.
Perfect. Perfect. We are on the same page.
I want actually my question today when I was coming and I read your memo, is that part that said effective February 15. I think, in my opinion, is too soon because I'm still dealing with renegotiate and trying to get to final the contract, the conversation. I have to switch my talk. When was Thanksgiving when we have the other memo? So in between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we changed the tune with the sponsor. Now January was okay. Let's finish it with the new, and they got used to or they start to accept some of the new rules. And now my time to sign, and I'm gonna have to change something by February 15, or can I go ahead and finish what I started, how I started, and use my February 15 for my new comments?
So I will make two suggestions. Look, if you're 3 days away from signing a contract, you can't change that right now. And I think we understand that. Having said that, please understand that in terms of recognizing the standardized budget and having these, you may or may not be aware this conversation actually, let me turn around. Within the room, has anyone heard the conversation about standardized budgets before this evening? When did they start?
Years
When?
ago.
Right.
Years.
Right. I hear 2 years. I hear
Several years.
several years. Do I hear anyone going for 4?
Perhaps.
This conversation has been going on for 4 years. And, quite honestly, the reason we haven't pulled the trigger is, I'm not quite ready for it, maybe tomorrow. So I think we are at a point where we just have to say the time is now. But of course, if you're 3 days away, you have to use good judgment.
No, I'm not
So we're
talking
not.
about 3 days. I'm talking about this month because OSP that is taking longer, and I'm not blaming them. I know they are busy, they are probably understaffed. My thing is, they already did my contract with my old rules.
So what
They're gonna start doing these rules now?
So let me be operational for you. Any discussion that starts at 5:30 this evening or later, use these numbers. Any discussion where you're in the first half of negotiation, whatever that time is, use these numbers. Obviously, if you're just about to come to closure, you can't switch. You'll lose credibility. But I hope you realize that we as a community have used the I understand but not yet argument for quite some time. And I think now we are well positioned to move forward. Okay? Thanks. Susan.
I had a large corporation yesterday tell me that they were very pleased to hear that UAB was going to a standardized startup fee because they were tired of being all over the board across UAB. And they said it didn't matter what it was, if it was standardized, they would buy into it.
Yeah.
And that was Genentech for anybody that
Right, and thank you very much for commenting on that. Genentech is not alone in that. In all the diversity that we have and the back and forth, that's time. For business, time is money. A week of business time is much more than we're arguing about. And so that consistency is something that we hear over and over again as a desire from the industry, but then it also rolls to consistency in the processes of doing the clinical trials as well as the budgeting. And so we've got to keep both in mind, and that's why we're so glad that Adam has joined us, although I would point out it's not just an IRB issue, it is all of us together. How do we work together more effectively as a team? Thank you. Other comments, guys? Yes?
So I'm one of the 10% of clinical trialists that is not including the research summary. So one, I'm sorry about that. But two, that makes absolute sense to do that. And I'm happy to rectify that. But I don't know
where in the process I didn't learn about that information. So is there a way that I can get plugged in and learn how to enter that information?
Yes, is the answer. So probably a quick offline after the meeting.
Sure.
And I'm sorry, I can't quite see your name tag.
Ashley Cannon, Genetics.
Ashley, I'm sorry, at this distance I didn't recognize. We will fix that.
Okay.
And it's easy to do. And again, I would stress, this is for patient safety.
Yeah.
Most of the time, the research summaries are really simple. And what we hope to do, once Adam gets his feet on the ground, is have a process where the research summary and the IRB come in simultaneously, because it's part of patient safety, and that's the primary goal of the IRB. And besides, when you're writing up the paragraph for the IRB, you've already got it in your mind.
Right. We have it for our genetics residents, so whenever they get a page, because they're on call, you've got it. I just need to know where to put it, so it pulls up in the medical records.
And we will have that right after this and get you lined up. Thank you.
Yeah, but if we do use Power Trial, we are requested summary trial. So if you don't use Power Trial, you don't have to do a summary trial.
I would, in your mind, I would incorporate that for every trial you need a research summary. I would hate like the dickens to have to go in front of the safety.
No, but how it is now, I understand what you say, I understand the safety.
Just right
but
there.
How it now, every time we do an on-call request or a Power Trial set calendar, we are asked for a summary trial, and that's when we fill the form and we send it to Alicia.
Right.
So that means that if I don't do Power Trial, and if I don't do on-call because that is not available on that study, I don't have to do summary trial, am I right?
Let me try some different words. First of all, as soon as we finish the financials, all other clinical trials will be in encore. If you were a member, or if sitting next to you were a member of the safety committee of the Board of Trustees, I would hate to be in your shoes having to tell the Board of Trustees member why you don't write patient safety summaries for the
I'm
patients.
not saying I don't like it. I'm saying how the system is set up now, we are asking for a summary trial when we apply to on-call,
Right.
or when we set Power Trial.
Okay, so write the research summaries. We will take them. We will do that. What else? Okay, guys. Final thing. Please take a look at all the handouts. There are likely questions that will come to mind. I'd be surprised if some don't, or some concerns. Please let us know what they are, because the only way we can effectively deal with them is by getting the questions. And thank you very much for your attention tonight.